I'll do it some other day. Someone needs to preach today. Yeah, preach that. So anyway. Okay. So we are in the book of Genesis today, which you're saying, wow, what a shocker. We're in the book of Genesis. We will be in the book of Genesis for, well, another, 13, 14 chapters. So we're coming to the end of it. We're in Genesis 37 today. And anyway, we have last week, just to refresh your memory, we've switched over to what I call the Joseph arc. Okay, where we have left behind the Abraham story, we've left behind the Isaac story, the Jacob story, although he's still tangential, but now we've switched over to what God is going to do through Joseph and to a big extent through Judah. Because if you'll recall, as we've talked about it already, Joseph gets the double portion blessing from Jacob, and he gets it because he gets two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. And the other one who gets the major blessing is Judah. The scepter will not depart from Judah. He gets the leadership role. Normally, the birthright put both roles into one individual, but for the tribes of Israel, that got split. Double portion blessing went to Joseph, and the leadership blessing went to Judah, and that we're going to see developed throughout the book of Genesis. We're going to begin to even see it today as we see Judah attempt to be involved in a more righteous fashion. It's not great, but he did okay. Anyway, so today we're talking about when God begins to fulfill your dreams. Now, this is important because Joseph has had two important dreams. He had the dream which he unwisely shared with his brothers. So we were introduced to Joseph last week, and it wasn't pretty. I remember when I, learned my Bible history when I was just very, very young, the Bible stories you get in school or in Sunday school. I generally considered Joseph almost like David. When David was called out as a young man from the sheep and the Holy Spirit lands on him because Samuel pours the oil on him, and then David from that time forth is kind of like this righteous character until the time he falls and all of that. But, we won't get into that. However, that's not how Joseph's story starts out. It's very clear, and we talked about this last week, that the first thing we hear about is he's supposed to be an assistant to two of his brothers, but instead he's bringing a miserable report about them to their father. And the Hebrew words which are used are always used negatively of the person speaking in every other instance of their use in the Hebrew Scriptures. So while most translations try to clean it up and says he just brought a bad report, but it's hard to do that in the Hebrew. It kind of exposes him as a malicious gossip. Now, he's only 17, and so we'll give him the fact that, a lot of us, when we're that young, don't understand how we're supposed to walk yet. The Lord hasn't showed us the error of our ways. And he certainly had not showed Joseph the error of his ways. And then his father unwisely gave him a very special coat. There's two ways to look at that coat. One of them, which has become a part of our culture, is that it was a coat of many colors. That's not what the Hebrew word necessarily says, although it could say that. But it really speaks about a coat that is as long as your palms or as long as the soles of your feet. And so it could be just a full-length coat. Whatever it was a special coat. And that means the brothers, every time they saw it, would know this was a sign of their father's favoritism. And he gave it to Joseph as a sign that he'd be the overseer over all the brothers. Which explains why Reuben did what he did, we studied the week before, when he attempted to take over the leadership of the tribe by sleeping with one of Jacob's concubines. Because Joseph was being groomed as the leader, and that coat demonstrated it. And they were fed up, the brothers. They were like, how can you leap him, the 11th born son, all the way to the head of the clans? And they were fed up with that. Now that issue wasn't Joseph's issue, but Jacob set it up. And then you had Joseph with the dreams, and the dreams were, hey, we were out in the field and we were, binding sheaves, and my sheaf stood up and all of your sheaves bowed down to mine. Well, I wonder what that means. And the brothers are going, great, he's wearing the coat. And Father favors him, and it's obvious he's going to become the leader. He's going to get the firstborn blessing and all of that. And now he's having dreams, and he's telling those dreams, kind of like rubbing it in their faces. It says they hated him for it. And then he has a second dream where the sun, moon, and the stars bow down to him. And that means even his parents are going to get involved in bowing down to him. And even his father has a hard time with that one. Because that's not the way it worked. The patriarch was always above the next leader. But obviously, we know how that worked out. Okay? So, if you know the story. But anyway, and Joseph shares that one. Today we're going to find out how angry his brothers were about the dreams. By the way, I pointed out last week when Joseph had that dream in two different forms, it means it was going to happen and it was being initiated. We know that because Joseph says that about Pharaoh's dreams. Two different forms. It was going to happen and it was being initiated. He lived the experience of a double dream that said the same thing. So today we got Joseph's dreams hanging out there, and this is what happens when God begins to fulfill your dreams. That's what we're seeing today. Might be a little different than what you normally think. We're in chapter 37, verses 18 to 20. When they saw him coming, remember we had seen him. Oh, and by the way, we saw him out in the field, and he got lost. And the Hebrew word which is used to speak about the fact that he's wandering in the field is a moral word. I showed you that last week, where it basically was saying he was out morally wandering. He was not on track. Every Hebrew reader would have caught that. And so it's just simply saying that he's not where he's supposed to be. Even morally. He's got this thing with his brothers going on, and it's not just one way. He's kind of, flaunting things to them. So he's coming to his brothers to check on them 65 miles away or 62 miles away from where they live. And this is not a safe place for Joseph. It's a long way away from Dad's protection. When the brothers saw him at a great distance, before he drew near them, they schemed against him to take his life. Each one said to his brother, "Look, the master of dreams. That one is coming. Now come, let us kill him and dispose of him in one of these cisterns. We will say an evil beast has devoured him. Then we will see what happens with his dreams." Think they were torqued off about the dreams? Yeah, I think they were too. So they see him coming at a distance. How did they know it was him at a distance? Because of the robe. He was wearing the overseer's garment. Now, he may have wore it all the time. It may have been something that was incumbent upon him when he had it, but now he's traveling way away from home, and his brothers are a lot annoyed about it. It might have been more circumspect to leave that back at home, but I don't think it would have mattered. So the brothers see him coming. They know he's coming, and so they plot his murder. This is brothers. That series is right. Oh, my goodness. As they're talking, come up with an idea. This is their scheme. They're going to just kill him out of hand and toss him in a cistern and be done with him. And then we'll say that an evil beast has devoured him. Nice. But you got this whole thing with the master of dreams. This is really sarcasm. I mean, they're really annoyed by his dreams. And so they say, hey, we're going to kill him, and then guess what? If we kill him, how are those dreams going to work out? And they realized they were going to cut his dreams off. They all thought it was a great idea. It tells you about their character. Okay? Except for one. One of them was having issues. However, when Reuben heard, he removed him from their power and explained, "We must not destroy his soul." Reuben also said to them, "Do not shed blood. Throw him into this cistern which is here in the wilderness, but do not stretch out your hand against him." He did this because he wanted to remove him from their power and bring him back to his father. So one of the brothers didn't like the idea and said, "Hey, no, here's the problem with blood. It cries out from the ground." They knew that. If the blood is on the ground and they shed it, it's going to keep coming up before God. So now let's not shed his blood. Let's just throw him into a cistern. Wow, that's nice. Now, this is why they listened to Reuben, because he was the firstborn. They'd been listening to him for his entire life. The firstborn was the next leader. Not in Reuben's case. Joseph was going to take that, and then Reuben really messed it up when he went and slept with Jacob's concubine in an attempt to take over the clan. And so Reuben was like on the outs, but the brothers still respected what he had to say, and they still listened to him because he was the firstborn. And so he said, "Hey, let's not kill him." And killing someone's a messy business. And he said, "Let's not kill him." He said, "Let's just throw him in the cistern." So he's forbidding the murder, and let's just throw him in the cistern and leave. Now, the cisterns that they had in that era were, they were dug out as you'd expect, but they were like a bottle where they were at the top narrower, and then they opened up as they went down. Then they were often plastered. If you get thrown in one of those cisterns, you, generally speaking, are not getting out because there's no way to climb. And it narrows at the top. So now you are in this, you just can't, there's no way. And so if they throw you in the cistern and leave, you are going to die of thirst in a couple days. If there's no water in the cistern, which we find out later, this one did not have any water in it. So he says, let's just abandon him to his faith, but that's not really what he planned. He got them to agree to it because it's like, yeah, let's do this, but let's not shed his blood. Let's just let him die in the cistern, and then we don't have to worry about it. But it was a ruse because he wanted to come back, and he wanted to rescue Joseph in order to be able to return him to Jacob. And you say, what was his motivation? His motivation is, he may have had as much as he struggled with his brother, he still had affection for him. That certainly could be there. Remember, he's the oldest brother. Joseph is not the youngest anymore. Benjamin's the youngest, but Joseph is right there as youngest besides Benjamin. And so he could have had a heart of affection for him, as annoyed as everyone else was with him, but not to the point of shedding his blood or murder. And that makes sense. I mean, it makes sense that one of the brothers or some of the brothers would have been less eager to shed the blood of another brother, but some of them were quite willing. And so anyway, he tries to be able to do it, and his whole intent, and I'm sure he also understood this would destroy Jacob. If Joseph is lost, he understood how emotionally invested that his father was in Joseph, and he couldn't imagine the pain that it would bring down on his father. And so Reuben comes out looking pretty good in this episode, but, obviously it doesn't quite work out. It says in the very next verse that it happened that when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, and yes, the word Joseph shows up twice, the special tunic which was upon him. Then they restrained him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty and did not have any water in it. When they sat down to eat bread, they lifted their eyes and looked, and unexpectedly a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead. Their camels were carrying gum resin, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way bringing them down to Egypt. Okay. Joseph is in the cisterns. By the way, remember the title to this message is When God Begins to Fulfill Your Dreams. Yeah. What kind of dreams have you been having lately? Joseph's were pretty high level. And all of a sudden, because he's thinking, you're all going to be bowing down to me. And so what happens? He shows up and they strip off his clothes, his garment, his cloak. He still had his undergarments, but or the garments that fit under the cloak. But at the same time, he's being stripped of his authority. That's what that means when they take the cloak off. He's being stripped of his authority, of his favor from his father. He has no protection from his father, and he's in a cistern. And I'm sure when Joseph is down in the cistern, he's thinking, wow, my dreams are coming true. One of the things we train people in as we teach the prophetic is we tell people, when God gives you a revelation of your future, generally speaking, you're going to step into the opposite of it first. That's the training ground. And we want people to be aware of that, because sometimes the words are high level, and if you don't go through a process, you could become arrogant. I remember once I went to Texas with a group of other pastors, and it was a prophetic thing, and there was a guy from the Kansas City Prophets there. First time I was around one of them, I believe at that time. Well, no, I was around him in other settings, but where I would be meeting personally with them. And while I was there, I just kind of hung back, because I was still a member of the denomination that does not believe in the prophetic. But I went because I wanted to experience more and more of this. And so all of a sudden, the guy calls all of the pastors in the room to the front. This is the prophet from Kansas City. It was a part of Mike Bickle's Kansas City group that he was raising up. And that was pretty impressive back then. And a lot of amazing prophetic people, John Paul Jackson, all those guys came out of that. And so we're there, and he says, okay, he says, those, and he calls up, and there's a whole group of guys, and I'm standing in the next, these are all Baptists, I'm the Lutheran guy, a little bit reticent, right? I'm checking things out, right? Because this is all brand new to me. This was 1994. And while he's praying for all these pastors, he suddenly does this. He reaches across, and he grabs me by the shoulder, and he pulls me in. There was no getting out of this. And he threw his hand on my head, and he began to prophesy over me. And he said, what would normally take years is going to take months. What's normally going to take months is going to take weeks. What would normally take weeks is going to take days. In your development in the gifts of the Spirit and walking in the prophetic. And, as you hear that, you're going, cool. And then he goes, you're not going to avoid the righteous process. And I went, that doesn't sound good. I didn't know enough to know. And anyway, so, I shared this message when we had left the denomination, and right before we were pretty much going to, have some major issues, I got up and I shared that message about what God wanted to do with our congregation, with us, because obviously the leader represents the head flows, the oil flows on the head, down the beard, and all that. And after months had passed, one of our leaders at the time came to me and looked at me and goes, guess we found out what the righteous process was, didn't we? Because we stepped into a real area of hardship. I mean, just the way it is. It's the Lord gives you a word, and now you have to press through it into the calling and purpose of God when things are suddenly almost the exact opposite of what it is that you've been told that God is going to do. That's what Joseph found out. And it was, obviously difficult. So the brothers take away the sign of the favor that was on him. And so they take away the tunic and, the special tunic. There's a real emphasis in the Hebrew on both Joseph's name and the special tunic. And they restrained him, seized him, threw him into the cistern. And thank God the cistern was empty, or he would have been standing in water. And when he finally couldn't stand anymore, he would have drowned. And so they then, because of the fact that they have done a righteous morning's work, They're hungry. Well, at least they thought it was a righteous morning's work. And so they're hungry, and they lifted up their eyes. And whenever that phrase lifted up their eyes is used in the Hebrew, in the Old Testament, it usually means something significant is just appearing in front of them. So this is getting our attention to look in this direction. Something significant is on the horizon. And they lifted up their eyes and looked on, and there's a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Gilead is that area to the east of the Sea of Galilee, and it is, about where Jordan is today. And so anyway, they come, the Ishmaelite traders are on their way. And so they're looking, and as they're carrying out their plan, and they're thinking, we're going to abandon him, the Ishmaelites show up. And they're looking at this, and they're carrying, by the way, the Ishmaelites are bringing gum resin, balm, and myrrh. These are the exact things that Jacob would later send to Egypt with the brothers to the leader of Egypt, or the second in command, who happened to be Joseph at the time. But he sends this exact same thing. These are products of the trees of that area. And so it's all sap from the trees. It's just different trees. And so now you've got these different products that are shipped down to Egypt all the time. And part of the trading process. So there they go. And they look up, and there's like this pregnant pause. They got their pita sandwich ready to bite. And then they look and they go, oh, looky there. At least one of them was a mercenary in heart. Then Judah said to his brothers, what gain is there if we kill our brother and keep his blood hidden? Come, we will sell him to the Ishmaelites, and our hand will not fall upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. Then his brothers listened to him. When the men, the Midianite traders, passed by, they pulled Joseph up and took him out from the cistern. Then they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they brought Joseph to Egypt. So, this is Judah beginning to step into his role. First of all, let's cover the difference between the Ishmaelite traders and the Midianite traders. Okay? There is no difference. This is from Judges 8, 22 and 24, and it's throughout. You can find other references. In the first verse, verse 22, it says, the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, both you and your sons and your sons' sons, for you have rescued us from the hand of Midian. Okay, that's what he did, got rid of the Midianites. And Gideon also said to them, I will request this petition from you, let each man give an earring from the plunder. For because they were Ishmaelites, they had gold earrings. So the Midianites and the Ishmaelites are basically they're identified together. And so just so you're aware of the fact, that's not a mistake in the text. It's just that they were either called Midianites or they were called Ishmaelites. There's a whole lot of discussion about, is one of them a broader designation and one a trading designation, or is what, ethnic or doesn't matter. You can call them either one you wanted to, at least from our perspective, because we don't have the nuances down. We just know that they're Ishmaelites and they're Midianites. And that's who they see. So Judah also wants to save his life. Okay? So we got two brothers, Reuben, and we've got Judah, who doesn't want to kill him. Judah's fine with getting rid of him for the rest of his life, but he doesn't want to kill him. He's our brother, and he states it very eloquently. He said, number one, you can't hide the blood. We have to hide it, and, it's going to keep crying out. And you know what that means? It means God's going to keep calling attention to it. And so what is, it's like the tale of the telltale heart. Thump, thump, thump. And if you've never read the tale of the telltale heart, you don't know what I'm saying. But it's like it's always calling out. The blood is always calling out, and so you're trying to cover it. You're trying to make up for it. I mean, I can imagine those brothers thinking, this is what's going to happen. Someone's going to show up one day talking to Dad and saying, I found this skeleton in a cistern. It was like a young man. He had this special signet ring on his face. I mean, you understand. And the brothers be going, ooh, because remember, their plot involved making Dad think he had been devoured by an animal. Now, how do you suddenly have a skeleton in a cistern when you said, oh, we found his cloak? And so now there's always going to be some inconvenient thing which is trying to expose you. That's part of the blood crying out. And sometimes the blood crying out is just in your own conscience. You can't live with it. That's the tale of the telltale heart. That's what that one's about. But Judas' idea is, hey, this is how we save him. We're going to sell him. Make some money along the way, Put it on deposit with the Bank of Canaan. So he's Judas' leadership. You start to see this leadership thing. They follow him too. They follow him more than Reuben, because Reuben said, let's just throw him in. And he counted on the fact that they were going to listen to him so he could come back and rescue him later. Judah says, I've got a better plan, and the brothers follow Judah's plan rather than Reuben's. And so it tells you right away that Judah is stepping into some level of leadership role, righteous or not, but he was trying to protect Joseph's life. And so he sells Joseph to become a slave in Egypt. This is certainly not like the most optimal thing that could be happening. Now, just imagine you're Joseph. You've come bebopping in by your brothers. They've taken your coat. They've tossed you in a cistern. They've said, enjoy the rest of your life. Now all of a sudden, the cover from the cistern is removed. Your eyes are being blinded. They lower a rope or cloth, whatever they do to get you out. And so they get you out of the cistern. You're thinking, thank God, they're getting me out of here. And then you see the Ishmaelite traders. And you're like, uh-oh, you know exactly what that means. They all know exactly what that means. These Ishmaelites, these Midianites are on their way down to Egypt, and they also sell slaves. And so you see the brothers weighing out silver, and you understand you're the product that is being bartered for. And you think, I wonder how he responded to all this. Well, we don't need to imagine it. We have what the brothers, their testimony of what was going on in Genesis 42 when they're talking before Joseph, saying, we're in trouble because of what we did to Joseph. They said each one to his brother, most certainly we are guilty because of our brother. When we saw his soul's anguish as he begged us, we did not listen. For this reason, this suffering has come upon us. So it tells us that Joseph did not go without pleading to his brothers. And that'd be normal. I mean, you'd say, what are you doing? Don't do this to Father. Don't do this to me. So he would be pleading with them and crying out to them and probably getting more and more desperate in his pleas, his anguish pleas, because he knows once he goes with those Ishmaelites, he's going to spend the rest of his life, short as it may be, depending upon who buys him, in Egypt. And it wasn't a pleasant prospect. Okay. And he gets sold off. Now, let's go back to the theme. When God begins to fulfill your dreams. Wow. Because you understand, there's a purpose to this. Joseph is going to end up the second most powerful man in Egypt, which means the second most powerful man in the entire known world of that time. And he needed to get to Egypt to make it happen. Sure didn't look like a blessing, did it? Sure didn't look like it was going to be the path to the promise that God had given him in those dreams by any stretch of the imagination. And there are times when we give up on the promises that God has given to us because we mistake the process that God is taking us through to get us into the place of our promise. We mistake that process as God's rejection of us. I got to ask you a question. How do you think that Joseph felt as he's on his way to Egypt? Me and God are bosom buddies. Yeah, I mean, you understand that Joseph, as he's on his way to Egypt, was also being assaulted by accusatory thoughts, accusations in his mind, showing him everything he had done in order to alienate his brothers. You understand, when his brothers took his coat and they stripped him and you can count on the fact they taunted him about his dreams. You can imagine that on the way down to Egypt, the enormity of his error was like right in front of him. His absolute insensitivity to what he had been doing to his brothers. Man on the street interview. So, Joseph, as you're sitting here in this slave's cart, what are you thinking? Joseph says, well, I used to think I was favored by God. But obviously, that's not true. I'm being punished because of the things I've been involved in. Now, was God going to be using the process? Now it's me again, not Joseph. Was God going to be using that process to develop Joseph? Yes, it was going to develop his character. It was going to mature him. It was going to get him into the place that he could be a trustworthy servant one day because he had gone through the process. He had seen God's promises fulfilled, and now God could trust him to be in that position of authority. You understand that it's very difficult to take someone out of a small tribal location and put them into a position of power like Joseph was put into because it's so far away from their experience. How could you even do that? It would be almost impossible. You know, one of the reasons that God took 40 years once Israel finally was able to depart from Egypt during the Exodus and Moses, one of the reasons that it took 40 years in the wilderness is that God had taken Israel out of slavery, but now he had to get slavery out of the Israelites. Just a different living experience. And we have different living experiences, and if all of a sudden we were thrust into a place of prominence, and we see this happening to people sometime, and they can explode in a spectacular way because they're not ready for the pressure. They're not ready for the spotlight. They're not ready for the position, and so they get their 15 minutes of fame, and then they flame out. Because they haven't been prepared. We see that over and over and over happening in our culture. And usually as they flame out, it's simply because they do not know how to control their own emotions and their own understanding and their own insecurity when they are thrust into that position. When you are thrust into a position ahead of when you are really equipped for it, it's hard not to flame out. Imposter syndrome is something that is real. It means you think someday people are going to find out that I'm not really qualified for this position that I'm going to be in, that I have been elevated to, and that's whether or not that's even true. One of the things a good development course does as you are bringing in new hires is you help them understand that they are qualified so that they don't have to deal with that and they use their qualifications to do the job that you have called them to do, and you take away their insecurities so that they are actually able to accomplish their purpose. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. hiring someone. Because if they think they're not qualified, then they're going to be more involved in always covering themselves than they are actually walking forward in their purpose. And so I think that's part of the reason that people explode. They're just not ready. They're insecure. They're thinking it's all about me when it's not. It's about service. It's about accomplishing what you are being called to do and to help people and all those things, and they just don't get it. Joseph was going to go through a process to make sure that he got it. The process was going to take not 13 weeks, not 13 months, 13 years. Okay? And they weren't going to be at the Ritz-Carlton. They were going to be some pretty difficult years as God prepared him for the role that he was going to take. This is when God began to fulfill Joseph's dreams. And don't miss this lesson. This to Joseph looked like failure. It looked like the end of his life. It looked like all the promises of God had shriveled up. If Joseph thought seriously about his dreams, he probably thought, that means I'm going to be a great leader in Canaan. So leaving Canaan to go down to Egypt looked like a disaster. What happened the last time his ancestors were in Egypt? Oh, that was Abraham and Sarah and that mess. And they don't go to Egypt. Isaac's on his way to Egypt. Don't go to Egypt. And Egypt is the exact place that Joseph was now headed. I can't imagine what that 17-year-old young man felt at the time. It had to be terrifying. So anyway, in the meantime, Reuben, who is obviously not there, if you saw a group of Ishmaelite traders on the horizon, you know what you do? Someone goes to protect the flock. Because that's lunch for a whole caravan. There's loose animals. You understand. So now someone's got to go protect the flock. Obviously, Reuben did, maybe one or two other brothers, but at least Reuben. So Reuben returned to the cistern, and surprisingly, Joseph was not there in the cistern. So he tore his garments. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is not there, and where shall I turn?" This is distress. Remember, he had his whole plan worked out. His dad wasn't going to suffer bereavement. This whole farce was going to be over. Joseph's life was going to be protected. And he goes to the cistern, he opens it up, he goes, "Joseph!" Oh, nothing but echoes. And he's like, he isn't in here. Probably dropped a torch in to be able to see if it was too dark. And when he tore his clothes, that's a clear sign of deep emotional distress. This was not something that was a minor issue for him. This was a major issue. And of course, just what he said to the brothers, "The boy's not there, and I have nowhere to turn." What? And he's frantic because now he knows that Joseph is gone. Then he gets told the story of what happened, and that's over. You can't pursue the Ishmaelites and get him back. It's just not going to happen. And so he understands this is a bad deal. I can imagine the tension. Besides that, the other brothers were happy with this deal. And they were starting to lean more on Judah than they were on Reuben. That was clear from the decision. And so there wasn't much that could be done right now except to carry out the plan. And the plan had already been discussed. So they took Joseph's tunic, slaughtered a male goat, and immersed the tunic in the blood. They sent the special tunic ahead. When they took it to their father, they said, "We found this. Please look closely at it to check whether it is your son's tunic or not." He looked at it closely and said, "It is my son's tunic. An evil beast has devoured him. Joseph has certainly been torn to pieces." And the brothers were saying, "I love it when a plan comes together." So the cover-up begins as they are going to sell this idea to Jacob. And so they send, it says clearly, they sent the tunic ahead of them, probably with instructions not to give it to Jacob yet, but to get the rest of the camp ready, okay, that they would start to understand there's a real problem coming. And then when they show up, because remember, they got to bring the flock. So they can send the tunic ahead, because would you want to hang a bloody tunic hanging around? No. Okay. They send it ahead, and then they bring the flock with them, and they head back that 62 miles. And then when they get there, and the whole camp at this point is like, already in mourning and apprehension and fear, because everyone knows whose tunic this is. And they bring it to Jacob, and Jacob, exactly what they said. We give him a bloody tunic, he's going to figure out a wild beast has eaten him, and that is going to be, he's done. He's dead. And so Jacob, they didn't have to lie to him. You get that? They didn't have to lie. Jacob had to lie to his father. Yes, it's me, Dad. I am Esau. They didn't have to lie to him. And, there's a whole bunch of comparison. When you think about it, they killed a male goat, and that was a male goat that was wrapped around Jacob's arms, the hairy. You understand. There's some real interesting parallels in all this. But they didn't lie to him at all. And Jacob they deceived him, but they didn't have to lie to deceive him. They simply had to present evidence that made it look a certain way. And so Jacob deduces Joseph's fate. Then Jacob tore his garments, put on sackcloth around his waist, and observed mourning rites for his son for many days. At that time, all his sons and all his daughters began to comfort him, but he did not allow himself to be comforted. He said, "It is because I will go down in mourning to my son in Sheol." So his father was weeping for him. So, Jacob's grief. He starts to observe the formal mourning rites, which would involve dietary restrictions, not using cosmetics or oils. He tore his clothes, the same thing, wore sackcloth. He did this for a long time. Many days means it could have gone on for years. And they tried to comfort him, all his sons and daughters, and you say, well, wait a minute, we don't know that he had a lot of daughters. All we know about is Dinah. Well, it could include the daughters-in-law, and it could also include granddaughters. So everyone in the camp rose up and tried to give him comfort, but he would not be comforted because of the fact that Joseph was gone. And he simply is, they're responding, not happening, and he begins a life basically of mourning for Joseph. Even later on, years later, 13 years later, when they're doing this whole thing, well, actually longer than that, about 20 years later, he won't even let Benjamin out of his sight anymore. He's still grieving for Joseph. And because of that, he's being overprotective of Benjamin, and we see that as that story unfolds. And he says, hey, I'm going to go down to Sheol. And remember, in the Jewish minds at this time, Sheol was the place of the dead. Half of it was paradise, half of it was Hades, was Gehenna. And so there was the place, it was a holding place, because we know now that until Jesus paid for the sins, no one could step into the presence of the Father without special dispensation, because it sounds like Enoch did, and it sure looks like Elijah did, but the other guys all went to Sheol, the holding place. And that holding place was, like I said, if you were a righteous follower of God, you went to the paradise side, and that Jesus explains that in the parable of the rich man and poor Lazarus. So he says, I'll go down to Sheol, but he's not coming back up to me. And he was weeping for him the entire time. This had to break the hearts of the brothers, but this was a part of their plan. And they followed through on it. Now, we got to find out what's going on with Joseph. Okay. During that time, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar. He was a high official of Pharaoh, the captain of the royal guards. Joseph's disposition. When God begins to fulfill your dreams, he puts you in the right place. You understand, of all the people that were buying slaves that day, most of them would have gone out into the fields. And they had been worn out by heavy labor. He gets to go to one of the closest officials of Pharaoh. so that he was an arm's length away from Pharaoh. This is not the luck of the draw. This is God setting it up so that Joseph was exactly where he needed to be. Even when he went to prison, it was Potiphar's prison where Pharaoh's prisoners would go to be incarcerated. You start to think of the story? We're going to get to it, but this is exactly the person that he needed to be under, and when he ends up in prison, it's exactly the step that was needed so that he'd be able to be exalted to the throne, the right-hand side of the throne of Egypt. And this is God setting him up. We know the end of the story, but Joseph didn't. And if Joseph didn't, that for him had to look like it was how he was going to end his life, in servitude. At least he was in a good household. But that's about as far as it was going to go. When God begins to fulfill your dreams, he puts you into the right position. He'll get you there. Even if it's through circumstances that you don't enjoy, he'll get you there. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for this amazing story of how you got Joseph into position, the very position that his dreams prophesied, through an unorthodox route that prepared him for the things that he was going to do. I ask that you prepare us also. We'd like to avoid as many dungeons as possible, but we do want to be prepared for your purposes. In your name, amen.